It's Ollie here from IT Career Helper, and today we're going to talk about server labs. Specifically, I'm going to talk about setting up a lab on your own environment without buying any more hardware or anything really. As long as you've got a PC or a laptop that's fairly good, you can follow this tutorial. I'm skipping the sort of very start, but what you'll need is a laptop or workstation running Windows 7 or above, and the Hyper-V role installed. Now you can install Hyper-V by going to Add Remove Programs on the device, and then do Get Windows Features or whatever it is. Turn Windows Features on or off, and then in here there's a tick box for Hyper-V, so we're just going to tick Hyper-V, press OK, reboot, and then you get Hyper-V, which gives you the Hyper-V management console in Windows Administrative Tools. You see you get a button for Hyper-V Manager, and we're going to use that as our lab. This is what it looks like. We're going to set up these 3 virtual machines, and we're going to get a working lab environment running Windows Server that you can then join virtual workstations or virtual servers to in order to test and learn and basically prepare for exams or prepare for things that you want to do in a production environment which you don't want to do without testing first. You could use this for testing Windows updates on servers. There's a whole bunch of things that you can do with this little lab environment. It's all behind a virtual firewall, so you can block it off from your internal network if you want to and have it completely isolated. It's a really sort of versatile way of getting a lab set up without buying any extra hardware or equipment. So let's get into building the first box and get into setting up the lab. So we've got a vanilla Hyper-V build here. I've already configured the networking, so I'm going to show you how to do that, and then we'll go ahead and we'll deploy some VMs into our lab. So first launch the Hyper-V Manager from your Start menu, and then go to Virtual Switch Manager up here on the right hand side, and you're going to need 3 virtual switches. We'll use 2 for the lab, and then there's a default one which comes with Hyper-V built in. So the default switch here is an internal network. We want to build a private network and an external network. So for the private, we just create a new virtual switch up here at the top and choose private and press create, and we'll get one of these, and you'll see that private is there. We don't have any VLANs or anything configured on it. It's literally just configured as private. And then for our external switch, we want to do the same. Go to new switch and choose external, and we want to bind that to our physical connection on the PC or laptop. So your wireless card if you're on a laptop and you're not cabled, or your wired NIC if you are on a PC that's connected up. And then you can tick this little box for allow management operating system to share the network adapter. And again, I'm not going to put a VLAN on here. I'm going to keep everything as a flat network with no VLANs. So the reason you want these 2 switches is we want pfSense to act as a firewall between our lab and our home network, or the network that we're connecting from our client host PC. So the external switch is going to pass through internet and other connectivity from your network on the network that the hypervisor sits on, and it's going to pass into that pfSense and basically act as the WAN interface for the pfSense, so the external interface for the pfSense. You can think of your network as the internet in this situation, and then the private network is going to be the actual local network of the lab. So we've got the two networks here. Everything on the private network will be able to talk to each other. Anything on this external network will not be able to talk into the lab unless we set up a firewall rule on the pfSense box to allow it to do so. So once we've got our network configured, we can come up here and we can just do new virtual machine. So I'm just right clicking on my PC name here. I'm going to call this lab firewall, and I'm going to choose to put it on my D drive, which is where I keep my VMs. I'm going to use a Gen 1 VM for this because it's the pfSense firewall. I'd use Gen 2 if I was deploying a Windows Server machine. And I'm going to leave it as having a gig of RAM. It doesn't need much RAM at all, doesn't need much space. So for this, I'm going to choose this will be the first NIC on the device, and I'm going to choose that to be the WAN interface. And for my virtual hard disk, I'm just going to give it a small disk in the folder there. And we'll do install an operating system later and click finish. So now we've got that, I'm just going to go into the settings. I'm going to add my secondary NIC. So you can see we've got our network adapter here, which is in the external switch. So we just want to go up and add a second network adapter. We'll put that on the private switch and apply that. Then we're going to connect up the DVD drive to our ISO. So we've got an ISO image here of pfSense. And we're just going to apply that. And then if we have a look in the BIOS, we've got boot from CD as the first entry in the BIOS, which is good because we want it to boot from this DVD drive. So now we can connect up to that and power it on, and we can go through the pfSense installation. So you'll auto boot into the setup here because we've not got a version of pfSense installed. So it's just going to run through this a minute. So we'll just go through this installation here. It's a sort of old school Windows XP style GUI installation, so we'll just accept that and we want to choose install. On here we can auto partition the disk because it's only a lab environment, we've only got the single disk. So we can basically just go next, next, next through all of this. We don't need to worry about any of this. You don't have to do anything here. You just have to press spacebar to select this disk. And then it will say, I'm going to destroy all the data. That's fine, it's a blank disk. So just hit enter there and it will go through and install pfSense. So when the installation of pfSense is finished, you'll get prompted to reboot. You can do that and wait for it to come back up, but we need to actually shut this VM down, so I'm just going to turn it off. We've not configured anything yet. We don't have any guest tools installed or anything, so we can't shut it down from Hyper-V. So I'm just going to power that off, and then we're going to go back into the settings, and I'm going to eject that disk. I'm just going to take the drive off. And then in the BIOS, we can have it boot from IDE, which is where the hard drive lives here. So you can see IDE controller 0 with the hard drive on it. So now the VM should boot into pfSense. Again, it'll auto boot here. So on here we don't need any VLANs. I'm just going to choose no here, and you can see there's two network interfaces in the middle here, which are both showing as down because we've not configured them yet. So I'm going to press no for VLANs, and now we can choose which interface we want to use for which connection. So 0 is going to be the first interface that we configured. As you can see here, that's the one on the external switch, and then the second one we configured is private. And that's going to be our internal network. So for WAN, we're going to choose HNO. And then for LAN, we're going to choose HM1. And it just asks us to confirm there what our LAN and WAN interfaces look like. We could press yes on that. So in the meantime, we'll have a quick look at our networking configuration. So you can see I've got my my local network here. My LAN is on 192.168.1.1, and then I've got a couple of VNICs here, which we don't need to worry about too much at the moment. So all we care about is that we're using 192.168.1.1 for our WAN subnet. That's a /24. Okay, so we've got pfSense up and running with an internal and an external address. We're going to want to log in and change this, but we can't log into the external interface because it's firewalled, which is what you'd expect. We could go in and use SSH to configure the firewall and let us get in on the management address there, but we're not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to deploy a VM, and then I'm going to statically assign it an address because it's going to be our lab DC, and then I'm going to use that to configure the firewall. So we'll just go and do a new VM again, and I'm going to call this one lab DC 01, and again I'm going to put it in D virtual machines, D virtual lab. I'm going to make this a Gen 2 because it's getting Windows Server, and I'm going to give it 4 gig of RAM. I'm going to put it on that private switch as well because it's going to be internal. The reason I'm giving it 4 gig of RAM, it's an arbitrary number, but I know that the Windows setup will definitely go through with that much RAM. You can also see I left dynamic memory enabled. I may have to turn that off to get Windows installed. I've had that problem a couple of times with older versions of Windows, like 2012 installing on Hyper-V, but we should be okay. And I'm going to give it a 40 gig disk because we're only using it for sort of lab testing, and it's not going to be doing loads of stuff. So we'll come in here. I've got an evaluation copy of Windows Server, so I'm just going to choose that ISO, and then I'm going to hit finish to build the VM. As soon as that's done, I'll connect to it and I'll power it on. And because I've chosen that ISO, it should boot straight to that. We may have to go into the settings and rearrange the boot order. Sometimes it doesn't work properly. Okay, so we got the press the any key prompt, but our console hadn't sort of loaded in time, so I'll just use the Control-Alt-Delete button to reboot, and then we'll boot into the Windows installation here. So I'm in the UK, I'll change my input method. I'm going to hit install. Now feel free to skip forward a couple of minutes if you've seen a Windows installation again, but this guide is meant to be for the complete beginner, so I will run through this process. So we've got 4 options for different versions of Windows we can install here. Now the difference between these is the standard, or the sort of one that doesn't say desktop experience, will install what we used to call Server Core, which is a version of Windows Server with no graphical interface, so you have to do everything through PowerShell. Or you can choose desktop experience, which will give you a traditional version of Windows Server with a graphical user interface. So I'm just going to choose Data Center here. I don't really care which flavour I'm using between standard and Data Center because I'm not going to license it because it's a trial and it's a lab. So I'm just choosing Data Center because that's the one that I come across most frequently in customer sites and in the wild in my sort of day-to-day work. So to be completely honest, I couldn't tell you what the differences between standard and Data Center are these days. It used to be mostly licensing related rather than features, to be honest. So we've got our drive here. This is the 40 gig drive I created earlier. I'm not going to press any of these buttons to control how I'm going to partition it. I'm just going to let it auto partition and hit next. So this installation will run through, and then we'll check back on it in a minute. Once it's completed, it will automatically reboot, and then we can log in and have a look at our server. So if you followed up to this point, you should have 2 VMs here in Hyper-V. We've got the DC and we've got the firewall. And if we go and connect up to the console on the DC, we can see it's rebooted, it's finished installing Windows, and we're just going to set a password so that we can log in. I'm just going to use something very simple because this is never going to be exposed to the internet. I didn't use password, but here we are. So we can now log in with our password we just set, and this is just a local user on the server. We don't have any Active Directory or anything yet. I just got prompted for like a resolution prompt thing there because it's the first time we've logged into it with an OS, so we just accept that, it's fine. So log in here, you notice what's interesting with Windows Server compared to when you build a desktop operating system. You know, if you've built Windows 10 or installed Windows 7 or anything, well, not 7 actually, but 10 onwards, you get prompted with a load of do you want to enable the language packs and typing and all sorts of other stuff. With Windows Server, you just boot straight into the operating system here. We haven't configured a server name or anything, like you would configure a username or a computer name on a desktop operating system. We've literally just been given the server, and now we can go off and sort of do what we need to do with it. So I can see here that we've got internet access, apparently. So we've been given an IP address from somewhere. I'm guessing that's from pfSense's default DHCP server. So if we have a look here, do an IP config, you can see that we've got 192.168.1.1 as our default gateway, and we've been given an address which is .100. I know that this is on my pfSense network rather than on my home network, because the DNS suffix we've been given is home.arpa, which is pfSense. Basically, its default settings in pfSense is different to what our DNS suffix would be if we looked at my one outside of Hyper-V. You see we don't have a DNS suffix by default because I'm just using an ISP managed router. So now we can fire up Edge and we can go to the pfSense IP address and we can configure it. The first thing I'm going to do is change that internal IP, because I want this to be a different range to what my home network is, because I don't want to get confused whether we're on the lab or whether we're on the home network. So I'm just going to come into Edge here and log into pfSense. So the default IP is 192.168.1.1, and we know that because our default gateway here is configured as 192.168.1.1, and also on the pfSense box that we connected to earlier, it showed us that the default password the default IP is 1.1. So by default we want admin and pfSense. So now we're logged into our firewall. We're going to go ahead and change the IP address of the interface. This is a little bit of a frustrating process, because we need to change the IP on here, then we need to change the IP of our server to a static address, and then we can come back in and update the DHCP pool on the firewall. So first I'm going to go to interfaces and choose LAN, and then I'm just going to update the IP address. I'm going to change it to 192.168.5.1. Doesn't really matter what IP you use here as long as it's a sort of legal IP address. And then I'll just save down at the bottom there. So it says LAN configuration's been changed. Changes must be applied to take effect. And it says don't forget to adjust DHCP if needed after applying. So I'm just going to apply there. And in the meantime, because we know this address is going to change, I'm going to change the interface address on my server as well. So I'll just right click on the little connectivity button there and do open network and internet settings, change adapter options, and then go into the properties of this network adapter and choose IPv4, and then give it a static address. So I'm going to give it 192.168.5.10, and then I'm going to set the gateway as the pfSense box, which I've literally just changed. And then for DNS, to start with, I'm going to set this to the pfSense box, and then when I've built the DC and I've configured DNS locally on the DC, I'll update that. So first we'll do that, give it a static address there, and then we'll just go to the new interface IP of the pfSense box. So again we use admin and pfSense because we haven't updated the default password. You should do that obviously, but again, because our lab's not exposed to the internet, I'm not going to do it. While we do have a WAN interface on here that obviously has internet access and allows us to get out to the internet from the lab, it's firewalled on my local network because this is treating my local network as the internet, so we don't need to worry too much about that. I'm not going to bother changing the default password for now. But obviously if your lab is actually fully internet facing and you're doing this on a physical device which has a connection out to the internet, you should do that. So now we need to do the DHCP, so I'm just going to go to services, DHCP server, and you can see here the range is on the old range, so I'm just going to update that to 5. So we've got 5.100 to 5.199. You'll notice I put my DC address as .10 because that falls outside of this range, so we're not going to get any duplicate IP addresses. And then I'm going to go down to save at the bottom. You also probably notice I didn't fill in any DNS servers. the DNS servers will be inherited automatically from what the firewall has set as DNS. At the moment, that will be DNS servers for the internet, but I will update those to use the internal DNS of the lab when I've installed it on the domain controller here. But we'll cover all of that further down the line. So we've done DHCP, we've updated the address, and now we can go ahead and install Active Directory. So I'm just going to open up Server Manager. Just wait for it to load, wait for this blue bar to stop going back and forth. And then we're going to do add roles and features. Next. You can see that our server's here. What I will do actually before we do this is just rename the server, because we don't want to join it to a new domain using the default device name. So it's just picked up a sort of random name there, and we're just going to go into the advanced system settings. So all I've done here is I've gone to system, and then I've gone down to advanced system settings, and then in here you've got a computer name tab, and in there we can call it lab DC1. Sorry, I've called it lab DC01. So we get prompted to restart. I'll go ahead and close that down and press restart. So we've renamed and rebooted, and we're just going to log back in and get the domain controller role installed on this box. So the first thing we need to do is open up Server Manager. It'll open up automatically when you log in. We'll just wait for it to all load, wait for this blue bar to finish scrolling across. When that's done, we click on Add Roles and Features here and then press Next. So we'll next through this as well, and we'll be prompted with our server here. We don't need to pick one from the list because it's already populated. And then we get a list of roles that we can install on the server. So the one that we want to install is Active Directory Domain Services, and it will prompt us to choose these sort of optional features and management tools and things. Just press Add Features there. Next again, we don't need to add anything here. This is already populated by the previous window. And then you get a little bit about Active Directory Domain Services here, which tells you need DNS and you should have 2 domain controllers. And it's got an advert for Azure Active Directory, which is now Entra, which we don't need to worry about here. And then finally we have the confirmation window where we can choose to restart, but we're just going to press install. So I'll just wait for that to install, and then we'll come back and check on it when it's finished. So what we've done at this point is we've installed Active Directory Domain Services, which is the role that allows you to promote this to be a domain controller. So on this little finish window here, we've got a button that says promote to a domain controller. It says additional steps required to promote it. Don't worry if you miss this and just hit close. This flag up in the corner of Server Manager will also have the same button. So we can go off and do what we want here. We could reboot the server or do other work on the server and come back to this afterwards. But when we're ready to continue, we can hit this little flag and then go promote this server to a domain controller. So we get a few options here. We can add a domain controller to an existing domain, which we obviously don't want to do because we don't have a domain, but that's what we'll do when we do our secondary domain controller. We can add a new domain to an existing forest. Again, we don't have a forest. This is the first domain controller in our domain and forest, so can't choose that one, or we can add a new forest. So we're going to choose to add the new forest, and I'm just going to call it lab.local. Microsoft's guidance on this changes a lot. It used to be that you would always have an internal domain name and you wouldn't call this what your external domain is. So for example, if you had lab.com, you would call this lab.local or something like that, lab.internal. Microsoft guidelines changed fairly recently to say that you should use your external domain, so you would use lab.com, the same as what your external domain is. And then they've changed it again to say you should use the internal domain for your root domain. So I'm going to go with lab.local, and I probably recommend that you keep to using local domain names. Certainly for this lab it's not going to matter, but it's something to look into when you do come to configure a production domain, and it's something that you should probably consider and check what the guidance at the time is, because you're going to be stuck with this for a long time. So we'll just hit next there. We get prompted to choose a functional level for the forest and the domain. Now what this does is this is the minimum operating system that a domain controller in the domain can use. So on our lab, it doesn't really matter, we're going to use Server 2016. If you were building a domain on an environment where you already had 2012 servers that you wanted to add to that domain, or you were migrating a domain into a forest that had older domain controllers, you may have to roll that back to an older version. But for this, we're going to stick with 2016. We can choose a couple of options for our domain controller. We can choose for it to be a DNS server, which we want, and it will automatically be a global catalog because it's the first one in the forest. And then read-only domain controller we can't choose because we don't have any other domain controllers. The DSRM password is essentially a local admin password for the domain controller in case anything goes wrong with the domain, and you can boot into DSRM mode and repair the problems basically to bring your domain controller back up. So this is a very important password that you should absolutely add to your password management system. Now if we hit next, we go to DNS options and we get an error about DNS delegation. That's because there is nothing at the moment that can resolve our new domain that we've just created, the lab.local. So we don't need to worry too much about that. You're always going to get this error when you're setting up a new domain controller. Now the NetBIOS name will automatically populate here. And that's just going to be the start of your domain, so without the .local. So this is the domain you would put with a backslash in front of your username when you're logging in. So if you want to log into a user, you would put lab backslash and then the username. You can change that, but I don't recommend changing it. For the databases, we'll just choose the default locations. I believe the best practice is actually to keep these as default. I think Microsoft's recommendation is to not move those. And then finally we can view a script which will allow us to automate deployment of more domain controllers, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to hit next here. And then we're going to wait for the prereqs to validate and then press install. So because this is a completely new environment, we shouldn't have any failures here. But if you're installing a new domain controller into the existing domain and it's a different version of Windows, or there are problems with DNS or other things, you may get issues here. So we're just going to hit install, and then again we'll wait for this to run through, and then we'll come back and have a look when it's completed. So our DC's rebooted here. You can see in the background I'm just getting a secondary DC ready, so all I've done is I've just created another VM and I've just run through the Windows installation there. So we'll hop onto that in a minute and join that to the domain. But for now, I'm going to come back onto my primary domain controller. I'm going to log back in. So a default administrator account has been created for the domain using the password that I set earlier for the local administrator. And that account has been sort of converted into our first domain admin account. So I'm just going to log in with that account. I'll get a new user profile because it is a new user. Great, so now we're logged in and we're on the domain. So we could go ahead and have a look at that in the system settings. If we go to run and do sysdm.cpl, all through the settings, advanced system settings menu that we went through earlier. So now under computer name, if we hit change, we get an error about not being able to change the domain on a DC, but we can see here that the computer name is dco1.lab.local and that we're on a domain called lab.local. So everything's gone through, everything's fine. There's no errors here in our ADDS blade in Server Manager, so that all looks good. And if we go into Windows Administrative Tools, we can see that we've got all of the Active Directory components here. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is users and computers. We can see here we've got our Active Directory structure, we've got users OU, we've got a computers OU, and then we've got a domain controllers OU that contains our DC. So these folders here are known as OUs, or organizational units, and the only one of these that is actually an organizational unit is the domain controllers one. The others are just folders, so you can't apply policies or anything to these folders. You have to create an OU and then move accounts into those OUs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an OU for our servers. So I'll just go to New here and choose Organizational Unit. You can tick or untick this. If you protect it from accidental deletion, it just means you have to go in and tick a box to say it can be deleted before you can delete it. And I'm going to call this one... no, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a top level OU called Lab. And then under this I'm going to build our OU structure. So some people do this by site, some people do this one for the company and then users groups. It all depends on preference. But I'm going to go for one called Lab, which would essentially be our top level company OU for this sort of operating section of the company. And then if I had another site or a different branch or something else, I may put it under another one. I might nest sites under this OU. It all depends on what the company's like. But because this is going to be a very, very small environment, I'm just going to use one OU. And then underneath I'm going to have an OU for servers. I'm going to have an OU for computers. And then I'm going to have an OU for users. And what you might want to do is also have a separate OU for admin users. And that just means you can apply policies differently to the admins and the users. Just continue that setup there. Right. So we don't want to move our domain controller into the server's OU because the domain controller has to live in the domain controller's OU. But if we add any new servers, with the exception of other domain controllers, we will put them in there. And I'll come back to OUs and group policy probably in a separate video and why it's important to keep this structure and what this structure is used for. But for your initial setup, it's enough to know that you should have a structure in here and that you should manage it and plan it out and think about it before you go ahead and just start throwing things onto the domain. The other thing we're going to have a look at, which is not necessarily important for this particular scenario, but probably is going to be important in your professional career, is Active Directory sites and services. So there's another Active Directory snap-in in Administrative Tools, sites and services there. So I'm just going to load that up. If we have a look at sites and services, you can see there's the top level which says this computer name, so that means this is the copy of sites and services stored on this domain controller. And then under sites you can see there's a default first site and there's some subnets. So if we go into subnets, we want to do a new subnet and we're going to put in the IP address range of that subnet. So we used 192.168.5.0/24 and that is our default subnet basically. And I'm just going to choose the default first site because we need to put it into the correct site. So I don't like using this default first site. I tend to leave it there. I don't rename it or anything. I just create a new site. So what I'm going to do is go to new site here and then I'm going to call it Lab. Again, that depends what your site actually is. And then we just press OK. And then I'm going to move that server into Lab. So now if we go into Lab servers, we can see Lab TCO1. And I'm also going to associate this subnet with the lab as well. So now we've got a subnet associated to this site, and we've got a domain controller associated to this site. And as I say, this isn't important for the lab necessarily, but it will be important if you have multiple sites and you have different domain controllers on each site. It controls how Active Directory replication works, and in here you can set up, you probably saw when I did the initial creation of the site, it prompted me to set up like the default inter-site transport thing here, this site link. So this is something you're probably never ever going to edit, but it's where you control your Active Directory replication. It's where you change the schedule of the replication, and it controls which sites replicate with other sites. That's not something that we're going to cover in this video, but I will go into more detail in another video about, we'll do an Active Directory deep dive and talk about things like replication. But for now, again, all you need to know is that you need a site, and you should put your domain controller in the site, and you should associate your subnet with that site. And anything that you add in the future, which is on this subnet, will then sort of know which domain controller to get its details from. So we'll come out of sites and services. We can come out of users and computers, and I'm going to jump onto DC2 and just get that on the domain. Okay, so we can do a couple of things on DC2 now to get it joined to the domain. So we've logged in, I've done an IP config, and I can see that I'm getting 192.168.5.1 as my DNS server. Now the reason I'm getting this is because DHCP is configured on the pfSense box, and it's passing down its DNS server to that device. So it thinks that DNS should be on 5.1, which it shouldn't. It should be pointing at lab DC01. So now we have configured lab DC01 as a DNS server. If we go in and have a look at its DNS addresses, we can see it's got itself as the DNS server. So that's the link local IPv6 address, and that's the link local IPv4 address. So basically this means this server is using itself to resolve DNS queries. But of course it must be using something else to resolve those DNS queries, because it can't resolve internet queries. So if we go into DNS Manager under Administrative Tools and have a look at the properties of that DC, have a look at forwarders, we can see that actually what's happening is DC01 is using 192.168.5.1, which is the pfSense box, to resolve external DNS queries that it can't resolve itself. So basically, if this server gets a request for lab.local DNS queries, it will resolve them. If it can't, it will then forward them out to 192.168.5.1, and that will try and resolve them. So what we want to do is we want to make DC02 use labDC01 for its DNS and not use the router. The reason we're doing that is because labDC01 has the DNS records for the domain on it. So if we look in the lookup zone, say for lab.local, you can see labDC01 has a record for what its IP address is. The pfSense box does not have that record. So if I'm trying to resolve this or anything on the local domain using this server, which is looking at the pfSense box, it will not work. So we need to make it use labDC01, because labDC01 will try and resolve it internally, and then if it can't, it will then pass it off to the router. So it's basically as good as having the router, with the added benefit of also being able to resolve internal DNS. So to do that, we need to go onto the DHCP server, and we need to add the DNS servers in here. So I'm just going to put the DNS server of labDC01 in here. There was a bit of a weird cut there where I went away and reconfigured how I reconsidered how I wanted to do this. I did think that it might be worth taking DHCP off the router entirely and putting it on the DC, and you'll see some small companies do that, or even large companies I suppose have DHCP installed on their DCs. It's not an unusual configuration. Some people will even have dedicated DHCP servers It depends on things like how many different ranges you need, how many clients you're servicing, whether you need to use DHCP reservations, whether you need to use DHCP options. There are things that Windows DHCP does better than DHCP on firewalls, but for this lab exercise I'm going to keep DHCP on the firewall, and where possible I recommend that unless you specifically need to use Windows DHCP for some reason, you probably should leave DHCP on the firewall. Now the reason for this is because your firewall is likely to have better uptime than your DC, or better uptime than a DHCP server. The firewall is also likely to need less patching and less sort of upgrading. So for example, I've seen with things like Windows 2012 end of life, people have had DHCP servers on 2012 and then they've had to upgrade those servers or migrate DHCP to new servers, whereas if they just had DHCP on the firewall they wouldn't have had to do that and they could have kept it up on the firewall. Now obviously it depends on the situation. If you want DHCP to be highly available, Windows DHCP is a very good option, but so is having a highly available pair of firewalls. So it's kind of a personal preference thing, and it's going to change depending on what your specific situation is and what your specific customer requirements are. But for this lab environment, for now, I am going to keep DHCP on this device, so I'm going to put the DC as one of the DNS servers to be given out there. So that change is applied successfully, so we're just going to renew the IP on this server. So we've updated our DHCP scope. I've done a renew on this server's adapters, and we can see that the DNS server we have now is 192.168.5.10, which is what LabDCO1's DNS address is. So now I'm just going to do an NS lookup on the domain, which is lab.local, and that should resolve to 192.168.5.10. Yeah, there we go. So we've got a couple of timeouts, not great, but it does resolve. So that means we'll be able to join the domain because we can now resolve what the domain is. So I'm just going to go to sysdm.cpl. We want to rename the computer. I'm going to call it labdco2. And I'm going to choose domain, and I'm going to choose lab.local. I'm just going to press OK there. And you're prompted to enter an admin account, so this needs to be a domain admin account. So we know that our domain is lab/administrator. My typing today is atrocious, and we know the password. So we're just going to bash that in, and then we'll wait for it to join the domain. We'll get a little pop-up saying welcome to the domain when it's worked, or we'll get a DNS error if it has not worked. So great, so we've got welcome to the domain, and then we need to reboot. So we'll go away and reboot, and then we'll come back, log in using the DA account. It's a pretty quick reboot actually, we might as well just wait for it. In the meantime, we can hop on over to, let's back up. Cool, we can hop over here and we can have a look in Active Directory, use some computers again, and we can just check that we've got a computer entry for this server. We have. So you can see there that under computers, which is the default computer folder, we've got labdco2. The reason it's in there and not in domain controllers is we haven't made it a domain controller yet. Interesting caveat here with this server is because we're using a domain admin account called administrator. If we type administrator without the lab / it tries to sign into the local admin account. So we need to put lab / in the real world. You wouldn't be using a domain admin called administrator. You should create your own administrator account and use that. But because this is just a sort of quick crash course in getting the lab up and running, we're not going to bother with that today. So the reason we're doing the second domain controller is, you may have noticed when we were setting up the primary, it said you should have 2 domain controllers, and the recommended thing is to make a secondary one. It's because if one of the domain controllers is down for any reason, that might not necessarily be because it's broken, it might be because it's being patched or another reason. It means that the other domain controller can still serve requests that would be going to the domain controller that's down. So you always want a couple of them for redundancy, basically. So we're going to follow the same procedure here. We're going to do add roles and features. We're going to choose the local server, and we're going to choose Active Directory domain services. We'll keep all the defaults exactly the same as we did before, and just press install there. And what that's going to do is it's going to put the Active Directory domain services role on this computer, and when it's sort of got the role and we can go to the configuration, we can choose the other option that we didn't choose before, which was add to an existing domain, and then we'll put it on the domain and we'll be able to use it as a secondary DC. One thing I will talk about while we wait for that is the roles that domain controllers can have. So if we type in here netdom query fsmo, just wait for this, we'll see that there are various roles that domain controllers can hold, and these roles can be put on any domain controller in a forest or in a domain, depending on what the role is. Some of them are forest wide, some of them are domain wide, and they do various sort of background Active Directory tasks. They're very, very important. If the server that has them on goes offline or breaks for any reason, you can do what's called seize them and move them onto another domain controller. We won't go into that in too much depth again. As I said before, I'll do a sort of Active Directory deep dive at some point, which goes into more troubleshooting and common issues or uncommon issues that you might face working in a production environment with Active Directory, and things like fixing issues with these FSMO roles. But again, for the sort of base knowledge you need to be able to set this lab up, all you need to know is they exist, and they're all on our primary DC at the moment. We can move them off if we want to, and if we were going to take that DC offline, we would move them onto another DC. But as I say, for this, you just need to be aware that they exist, and it's also worth sort of learning what they do and what they are, because it's a pretty nasty and fairly common interview question I've seen, where people will ask you about them, and if it's not something you've come across before, you just sort of sit there looking a bit silly, because it's one of those things people expect to be common knowledge, but it's really not. So we're going to add a domain controller to an existing domain. We'll give it the same capabilities as the other one. We could cut the global catalog potentially. I think guidelines are you have one global catalog per site maybe, but I'm going to leave it on there just because, as I say, this isn't production. It's just a lab device. What the global catalog does as well is it lets you look up information on other domains in the same forest, basically. So say we had this domain that we're working on, and we had another domain in the same Active Directory forest. Our global catalog server would be the one that does lookups into other domains. So you probably will have come across it. I think I can probably demonstrate it in Active Directory maybe, if I'd just look at a random. Don't really have anything to look at yet. Maybe the search. Yeah, here we go. So if we do browse here, you can see we've got entire directory, and then we can see lab, which is our domain. If we had other domains in here, we'd only be able to see them if we were looking on a global catalog. But again, that's probably a bit deeper than what we need to go into today. So I'll take it off. As I said, I don't think you need it. This one, we don't care about the DNS delegation thing. It's expected. We don't need install media. That's if we've dumped any settings from another domain controller. And then you can see here we're configuring this server as an additional domain controller for the domain lab.local. It's going to replicate from any domain controller that it can see, which is the only other one we've got, and it's going to put DNS on here, and it will be configured to use itself as DNS. It'll automatically reboot at the end of this process as well. So once this has gone through, we'll see labdco2 in our domain controller here. If we do another netdom query, we won't see any Fusmo roles on this DC because they're all on the primary one, and they're only ever on one server at a time. But we will have two DCs in here, and we'll be able to do DNS lookups against either of those DCs, and we'll be able to do things like join the domain, whether one DC is up and the other one's down, or whether they're both up, or whatever the situation is. So if this DC ever dies, we're still able to query the domain, basically, is the reason that we want to have the two of them. So at the end of this video, you should end up with 3 VMs. You've got a firewall running pfSense that we can log into, we can use as the DHCP server, and we can use for sort of general networking inside the lab environment. We can also use that to get out to the internet if we need to from this lab, because it's treating our local network as the internet. So we go to Google from inside the lab. It's super slow, but it works. And we can then get out to the internet from lab servers to do things like get software or anything else we might need internet access for. We can lock that down through pfSense so that only some servers can get out to the internet, or only certain services can get out to the internet. For this demonstration, I'm not going to bother too much with that. I'm just going to give the servers access out. But it's nice that the reason I like to do a lab this way is I like to have the granular control that having a firewall in front of the environment gives you, and also having the firewall is more like a production environment. So if you want to set this up in a similar way to how you would set up a production environment, this is a very good way to do it. Additionally, if you wanted to have a couple of sites within this lab, you could deploy this infrastructure twice. You could do a site-to-site VPN between the WAN IPs of these pfSense boxes on the external network, and then put some DCs in the other site and sort of treat them as two separate sites, even though they're all on the same hardware. So it's a very scalable, a very fun way of labbing your environment, and it's a nice way of learning, and a nice thing to have for practicing for exams, things like that. Because it's got internet access, you can link it up to Microsoft 365 services or Azure services. So it's a nice sort of true to life way of learning Windows Server and learning how all these services work. I'm not sure what the next video is going to be on, but it will be on something that we can do with this lab. It might be around DHCP or DNS, or it might be a sort of deeper overview of Active Directory and how it all works. I might get some clients linked up to here and start do some group policies to sort of show you how they work. But if there's anything specific that anyone wants any more information on, or if there's anything that you'd like me to cover that I haven't covered, or you'd like me to cover in more detail, I can do. Just leave me a comment, and don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell button on the video so that I can keep making videos and keep putting out this training content for free.